The Argos last year, they were dominant. It was like I thought they were going to destroy everyone, and they get upset and they don't do it. Like, what do you envision this year with the quarterback situation and all that's become of it? What do you make of the Argos?
It's really tough to know because, like a lot of teams that are sort of at the top of that building cycle, they're 16-2 last year. You're going to have a lot of players have good seasons when you're 16-2, and the nature of free agency in the CFL is, they lost a lot of good players in the offseason. And that's part of doing business, right? You got to be able to replace guys, and
Sure.
That's just the nature of football. But then the Chad Kelly bomb drops, right? And I was talking to Ryan Dinwiddie about that a little bit today, actually, about how, because that came out basically 72 hours before, the start of training camp. And he said, they were anticipating a suspension. They weren't anticipating 9 games. And, the quarterback room behind Chad is very inexperienced. I mean, Cameron Dukes is a second-year player who barely played any meaningful football behind Chad last year. I mean, basically every game that Chad Kelly started and finished, they won. He played a half of meaningful football basically all year. They got another guy, Brian Scott, who's their number 2, and they brought back Nick Arbuckle, who's a veteran who's played for Dinwiddie twice before in his career, so there's some familiarity there. But, the sort of 5-step drop and let's air it out Chad Kelly game that everybody got used to, that's not going to be the Argo offense this year. You're going to see more like game managing, kind of minimize risk, that kind of thing. And I think just try to, keep their heads above water until I think they hope that Chad Kelly comes back, by the end of August, assuming that the league reinstates him after 9 games. But, you mentioned, it's been like such a great year last year, 16-2, everything couldn't have gone better for the Argos. And then it's like that day, November the 11th, when they got blown out by Montreal in front of like a legit 27,000 crowd, like the biggest Argo crowd in ages. And they go and, lay an egg doesn't even do it any sort of justice. And then the Kelly thing happens, and it's just it's been a rough off season for the Argos, but I still think they might be all right on the field.
How about some other teams? How about Hamilton with Bo Levi Mitchell? Can he regain his touch as an all-star quarterback?
It's been 6 years since he's been the guy. 2018 is the last time Bo Levi Mitchell was the Bo Levi Mitchell that we think of the first half dozen years of his career, And
what about a renaissance, Naylor, a renaissance season?
You know what? I went to their scrimmage a couple weeks ago. They had a scrimmage on a Sunday night. He looked really good, even by his own admission after the game. He thought he played really well. So, look, Bo's I think he's 33, and like the issue last year is he barely played, right? And it was funny. They didn't play him in a playoff game, and he stands at his locker and says, well, when your highest paid player isn't playing in a playoff game, you're not coming back. And I would have agreed with him 100%. They did a U-turn. I guess they just looked at the options and said, you know what, we're going to roll with Bo Levi Mitchell one more time. He doesn't have to be the old Bo. He just has to be a percentage of the old Bo and stay healthy. So, they've had some high turnover. They got some longtime veterans that have been there forever. Simone Lawrence, Ted Laurent. 10-year guys that have retired. So there's going to be some turnover there. But frankly, I'm a little surprised they rolled the dice on Bo just because, of his history. And you guys know this in athletics. Sometimes it's not one injury. It's not one big injury you're trying to come back from. It's a series of, nicks and pulled muscles and shoulders. And that's where Bo is over the last 5 or 6 years. He's just had so many, things that have kept him on the sideline. But they are going to roll the dice again in Steeltown.
With Dave Naylor, CFL returning tonight, CFL on TSN, Winnipeg, Montreal. And, obviously the Alouettes, they stunned the Argos in that playoff game. And they smoked them. It wasn't even close, and they never really looked back. They're the prohibitive favorites now in the East. Ottawa hasn't been great. We just talked about Hamilton. The Argos are dealing with what they're dealing with, not only Chad Kelly, a lot of turnover as well on both sides of the ball. But, if you're Dinwiddie, if you're Pinball, let's presume Kelly returns, which we don't know. But if he does and he returns to the form he was in last year, do the Argos, if they can get above 500 and get in or hover around 500, that's going to get you into the playoffs likely in the East. They're not going to talk about it publicly because of what they're dealing with right now, Dave, but could you see 2-3 months from now they actually think they could win a Grey Cup?
Yeah, I think the division's kind of flat, right? Ottawa has been terrible for 4 straight years, and they're auditioning a new quarterback who was the backup in Winnipeg behind Caleros and Drew Brown, but that's a mystery. We already touched on Hamilton and Montreal. Look, they were surprised last year, but one of the things when you kind of win before people expect you win, including yourselves, is your roster isn't, torn to shreds because everybody's not at the end of that cycle, right? Like Austin Mack was maybe their best offensive player. He's with the Atlanta Falcons now, the receiver that they had one great year from last year. And the rest of that team's pretty consistent. So, especially early in the season, you usually benefit from roster consistency in football, and Montreal should. And again, their players are not 33. Like, they have a lot of younger guys, so they should progress and be better and be competitive. But I do think that with the Argos, I think that certainly is the case. I mean, there's some turnover on this team. I mean, AJ Ouellette, who kind of became a fan favorite last year in the backfield, he's gone. But I think the division is not. It's not like they're running away from them. And it's not like they were 9-9 last year. They were 16-2. So I do think that's the way they're approaching this season. That they feel like they still have a pretty good roster. A lot of the guys who were moving up into starting roles are guys that were backups or on their practice roster last year, so there's familiarity and continuity in that. It's not like you had to go out and just get a bunch of new guys that don't know your system and don't know your coaches and all those kinds of things. So I think they feel pretty optimistic about that just because of where they stand relative to the division. And there's still, even with the defections of the offseason, there's still a very talented roster there, particularly, as we know, football is so much decided in the trenches, right? It's not what the fans talk about. They love watching the ball go through the air and guys dance into the end zone. But if you look at along the lines of scrimmage, offensive and defensive, this is still, a pretty tough, physical, talented team, and I think that's probably going to carry them through.
Naylor, the Kelly situation, it's hard to get away from. It's a polarizing player, and it's a serious matter. And could he still be facing more discipline? Like, are you satisfied with what you know about the situation as far as that was it? And this is I don't even know if it's the appropriate punishment, but just from what you know, does the suspension fit what you're aware of this situation?
Well, I mean, there's 2 processes here, right? The legal process, that's done. We reported this week that they've got a settlement through mediation. Chad Kelly's no longer facing, legal issues in Canada. The Argos aren't the subject of a wrongful dismissal suit. That's over. But the CFL discipline, I mean, they basically asked him to submit himself to assessment and counseling and I believe the counseling lines up sort of concurrently with the suspension. So if he doesn't begin the counseling on time, a 9-week suspension can become 10, 11, 12. It's kind of like, you let us know when you're ready, but we're not starting your suspension until you go through that. As I understand it, that's kind of the way this has got to play out. Now, he hasn't said anything publicly other than a very carefully worded statement about 3 weeks ago, which I think was carefully worded in part because the legal issue had not been resolved then. But here's the thing. You got a really weird situation in the CFL right now where a guy who violated the gambling policy in Sean Lemon, the defensive line with Montreal, is going to be on the field tonight playing in Winnipeg because he's appealed his suspension. And even though he's not being represented by the CFLPA in that appeal, read into that what you'd like, the rule says, hey, if you appeal your suspension until they get the hearing, you can play. So could Chad Kelly appeal his suspension and play? I don't think so. And the reason is I just think the Toronto Argonauts understand that the nature of this whole circumstance, that there's got to be some image rehabilitation here for him to come back and be the face of the franchise and resume his career. And that would be awfully tough to do while he's playing during an appeal. If he appeals, it doesn't mean he can play right away unless the club lets him. In Montreal's case, they have let Sean Lemon play, with some criticism to that. I don't think the Argos are going to say, I think what they know is that the longer you fight this thing publicly, probably the deeper you dig yourself in the public's eye. So I'm not anticipating that Chad Kelly's going to be playing again. I think that the question is going to be, when does he return to practice? Because he's eligible to practice, and he hasn't been near the team since, at least anybody's seen, since May the 9th, when he showed up at an early camp practice, and there was a big public outcry and some media outcry about what's he doing right back after, the same week he was suspended, and all of a sudden he's gone away. So, I think this thing, it's basically in his hands. If he doesn't do what they want him to do, and I haven't spoken to him, so I don't know what his level of willingness is, this thing could extend itself. It's not a guarantee that he's going to be back. The league has reserved the right to extend his discipline and revise it. And so, this thing is, I guess, unresolved would be the fairest way to describe the situation there.